Welcome to Write Night. This is one of my older interviews from Sounds of Steam from 2012 through 2014, or one of the interviews I did at a convention along the way. So sit back, relax, and enjoy a little bit of retro interview from myself and others. And we're here on the auspicious occasion of having K.W. Jeter, the gentleman who coined the phrase steampunk. Welcome, K.W.
Hey, howdy. Good to be here.
Glad to have you. So, you coined the phrase steampunk, huh?
Yes, I did, and it was totally a joke. One of those historical accidents that seem to have led to bigger things. The point I always make, or I try to drill into people's heads, is that I didn't invent steampunk, the genre. Mm-hmm. Pretty much, there were forerunners, of course. Right. And certainly all the things that a lot of talented people have been doing with it since then, they would have been doing it whether or not I had come up with some crazy label to stick on it. So, as I said, not the inventor of steampunk, the genre, the coiner of the word, as you point out. And it's somewhat both fascinating and intimidating to see what, as I said, so many talented people have done with this thing.
I'm actually curious, when you walk into a room and somebody realizes that, what kind of range of reactions do you get from people when they go, hey, you're that guy?
It could be a wide range of reactions. One is, I think most people aren't aware that anybody at all coined the word steampunk. They just think it's part of the English language, like cat or dog or whatever. And the notion that somebody who's still alive actually coined a word that has now become close to common parlance is an interesting thing. So as I said, a lot of time there's a reaction of, really, somebody actually invented the word? It didn't just sort of spring up from the ground fully formed. And
that's a good reaction.
Yeah. And so, and then other people are aware of my connection to it. Really, the official archivist of my connection to the word was actually my wife. She was the one who kept track every time somebody used the word and said something about how it came into being. If it wasn't correctly attributed to me, she would very graciously point them out to the evidence about it, and she was the one who really kind of kept reminding people about it. And so, as I said,
a bit of a genius move on her part, really.
In some ways it was. I mean, otherwise I might have completely faded out of it entirely. So so I'm entirely responsible to my wife for that.
Well, glad you're able to stick around. And now I looked through some of your other writings and whatnot and checked some of them out. And I see you've written Star Wars, Blade Runner, a follow-up to H.G. Wells' Time Machine, and all that. Did you have a favorite out of all the genres or themes or well-known storylines? What was your, I just love this one best?
That's one of those questions, like, which of your children do you love more than others? Even if there were one that I love more than the others, it's kind of ungracious to say so.
We won't tell your books.
But I think in a lot of ways I'm very gratified that the steampunk thing has become a genre in itself.
Yeah.
Because it gives me a lot of opportunity to join in with these other people who are having so much fun with it and start having some more fun with it myself. I mean, I have a certain fondness for, both the real Victorian and Edwardian literature, the people who were actually living then and who wrote such amazing books. Mm-hmm. And I have a real fondness for what the crazy parodies and takeoffs and inspirations that people have been getting from it since then. So if I were to pick out one of my kids that I like better than the others, I would probably say, well, maybe the steampunk thing. But at the same time, there's some kind of dark, dystopian, noirish science fiction that I also do. Mm-hmm. And when I'm working on one of those books, I think, oh yeah, this is what I really love. This is my favorite. And then when I'm working on a steampunk book, I feel, oh no, this is what I really love. So it's one of those things. You just you divide your affections as best you can.
as Wendy and I were reading your latest book, Fiendish Schemes, we noticed you have a very Victorian feel to your use of language when writing. And even looking at some of your other writings, it was a very similar feel. But for example, the Star Wars books, it was the same use of language with the different phrases and whatnot that matched the genre.
Yeah, I noticed that very much. It's the style of your writing definitely evokes that Victorian, style of writing.
I guess I have a little knack for being a bit of a language chameleon, and I can adapt to different things. And in some ways, I think sometimes I have a little bit of an advantage over some people in regard to sort of imitating Victorian prose, in that I've read more than just the usual suspects. I mean, we get a lot of our impressions of Victorian prose from the big names, big literary names like Charles Dickens and people like that. And I was always, even a long time ago when I was in college, I was reading some fairly obscure Victorian and Edwardian writers who have now become better known. There's been something of a revival for some of those people. Novelists like George Gissing. Gissing is actually a friend of H.G. Wells and just a fabulous writer, and probably the bleakest and darkest of all the Victorian writers.
Even darker than Bram Stoker.
Oh yeah. Gissing is just, Gissing could easily compel you to throw yourself off the top of a high building.
I've known a few people like that.
Yeah. So Gissing was a big influence, and but then there's a lot of the other writers that tend to get dismissed as being sort of the Victorian era's equivalent of pulp and trash and junk, and they're not really given the attention that they should be given now. The one I always refer to is Harrison Ainsworth. Harrison Ainsworth was close to being the Stephen King of Victorian fiction. He was a flat-out thriller writer, and even back then he was considered somewhat trashy. And he's an incredible writer. I mean, people dismiss him far too casually. He's probably best known for a novel called Rookwood, which contains a famous description of the highwayman Dick Turpin's ride from London to York in one night. And it's quite a long description, and the legend is that Ainsworth wrote it at the same speed that Dick Turpin would have made the ride. And so it was done in the same time equivalent. But I was also looking at one of Harrison Ainsworth's other novels that I hadn't gotten around to until just recently, and that's one called Dick Shepherd. And I was amazed at what a virtuoso writer Harrison Ainsworth is. The first 5 or 6 chapters of the book is just one continuous, spiraling, crazy, dreamlike, violent escapade. And it's just an amazing book. And like I said, we often have a sort of confined, stilted impression of what Victorian writing is like because of just limiting ourselves to the big names.
Right.
Of course, Dickens was a fine writer, but his style was very much more stately and slow-moving in some ways.
Well, he was also paid by the word, so he put extra in there to beef it up.
Yeah, they all were.
And if you look at people like Mark Twain, who was much more casual and that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's a range, but we really have about a half dozen to choose from if we just pick off the top of our head.
Absolutely. And so what I think is exciting or one of the things that's exciting about the steampunk genre is that it's in some ways reconnecting to not just the big names of Victorian and Edwardian literature, but some of these other people who have gotten a little ignored, or at least in this period. And so in that sense, the sort of fun, exciting, adventure, even trashy element of steampunk is, to the extent that it reconnects us with the wide range of what Victorian literature really was, in that way, it's quite a worthwhile thing.
Why don't you name a couple other Victorian authors that you enjoy, so the listeners can kind of have a list to choose from?
Oh, you're catching me out. My memory's so shot these days.
We'll look them up then, or you can drop us a note and we'll pop them in for folks.
There you go. I mean, Harrison Ainsworth is the one I always refer to, but then again, I've kind of made myself into a one-man anti-defamation league for Lord Bulwer-Lytton, who I think is unfairly ridiculed. He was actually a fine writer. There's a bunch of Bulwer-Lytton's books that are just really worthwhile. And I was talking about this when I was on the steampunk panel just recently at World Fantasy Con in Brighton. Bulwer-Lytton's novels are really worth reading. I think the one that people usually refer to because it's got the most science fictional aspect to it, and people still read it, is The Coming Race. That's quite a good book. But I do make the stipulation that Bulwer-Lytton's poetry, of which there is quite a lot, is pretty bad. He was probably the worst poet in the world. So
poetry is so personal that it's hard for it to be good, to be universal.
It is, yeah.
It's hard to find anything worthwhile in Bulwer-Lytton's poetry. It's amazing that there's such a dichotomy between his novels and his poetry. But then again, you can have a lot of fun with his poetry. There's actually a quite long retelling of the myths of the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur and everything, that Bulwer-Lytton did. It's his version of the Knights of the Round Table. And I was reading it. You can get all these things off the Gutenberg project. They're pretty easily available. But I was reading this long, epic poem that Bulwer-Lytton wrote about the Knights of the Round Table. And I was starting to drift off because it was so boring. And all of a sudden I realized that I had just read an account of King Arthur traveling to the Arctic Circle and fighting demonic walruses with blood-stained, dripping fangs. And I thought, or tusk. And I thought, did I really read that, or did I just imagine that? And so I kind of, dialed up my consciousness and I thought, oh, no, it's really here.
That sounds like something that you should be at a steampunk convention and do a round-robin reading of.
Really? That's a good idea. We should do that. I will take that into consideration. Because, it is actually a Knights of the Round Table epic poem by Bulwer-Lytton that includes King Arthur going to the Arctic Circle and fighting demonic walruses.
That's a themed room party right there.
It is. Absolutely. I love that. So I don't know if that indicates that at that point Bulwer-Lytton was completely insane, or he was just, taking too much, drops of opium with his friend De Quincey or whatever. But, that way it is kind of a fun thing. But, those early Victorian writers, there was just such a wealth of material there that, as I said, I think I have maybe a little facility about imitating Victorian prose just because I exposed myself to a wider range of it.
Wendy, did you have a question?
I was just thinking that sounds like something Douglas Adams would write, but I'm wondering if you ever considered doing, children's literature, steampunk, because when you write, you kind of paint a picture with your words, and I would love to see you do something for children. Do you ever think about that?
Children or young adult?
Children and or young adult, either one.
You're not the first person to ask me about that, and so there is something simmering on one of the back burners in that regard. Right now, we're kind of waiting to hear about whether we'll be going forward with the proposed sequel to Fiendish Schemes. We've got a proposal. My agent and I have got a proposal out with the editors about that, and I think it's a pretty sure bet that it'll happen, but then you never know. And one way or the other, there will be some continuing of the Fiendish Schemes, Infernal Devices, Fiendish Schemes sort of string. But at the same time, there are some other things that I'm cooking up, which I am, of course, superstitiously not free to tell you about.
Understandably.
Yeah, there we go. it's always bad luck to talk about these things before they actually happen. But yeah, I am there. Like I said, there are some back burner stuff that I hope to turn the flame up on very shortly. And so I'm glad to hear that that's something that you'd be interested in.
Well, let us know when it goes forward, and we'll definitely talk about it and let people know.
My internet minions will be, of course, publicizing anything that happens.
Of course. But with Fiendish Schemes itself, Wendy and I have both been reading it, and we don't necessarily want to give spoilers.
Yeah.
But you have some really cool concepts in there that...
Thank you.
And I haven't seen them approached anywhere else. And I'm debating how much I want to tell, because a lot of it happens that I want to talk about in the first 20 to 30% of the book, so I don't feel it's a spoiler per se. But how much do you want to reveal to folks, or do you want to keep it a total mystery?
You can reveal a few things, just don't, reveal the ending or anything. Yeah,
no.
Well, certain things, of course, are already stated in the blurbs related to the book,
Sure.
such as the walking lighthouses, which are really nifty.
Yeah.
Lighthouses and the Victorian era have always kind of been on my mind, and I was always kind of looking forward to doing something with them, because there's a great book out, and I'll have to look up the author's name and get it to you. A nonfiction account of the relationship of the Stevenson family, of Robert Louis Stevenson's family, with the epic construction of lighthouses along the British coastline. And I think what is the book's title? I think it's The Lighthouse Stevensons. And Robert Louis Stevenson actually came from a family of engineers. These people who built these incredible lighthouses and built them under astonishingly adverse conditions. I mean, going out there and building a lighthouse on some of these remote locations on the British coast were just epic feats of construction and design and engineering. And that's the family that Robert Louis Stevenson came from. And so it's a great book, and I'll make sure I email you the info on that.
Yeah.
But so lighthouses had always sort of been on my mind, and I wanted to do something with them. And so I kind of took that little interest pod and combined it with the George Dower and his father's crazy inventions sort of thing. Things just sort of happened, and came up with that sort of fun notion of the walking lighthouses. And
well, to give a little more of a teaser into the book, the reason there's walking lighthouses in your world, which is a historic version of our world, an alternate reality, if you will, of our world, and the oceans have been discovered to be living beings. And the lighthouses are necessary so you can move them to different areas and predict the ocean shifts. And introduced in the first 20% of the book is a preacher who wants to talk to whales to talk to the oceans.
Yes.
That is such a fun concept. And also the way you immerse all of London in the steampunk feel, and literally steam.
Yeah. I dialed it up as far as I could at the time, and I'm going to dial it up even further, I think, in the subsequent books. And it's kind of a complicated plot, but I like complicated plots with sort of weird connections and things like that. And it's kind of fun, to make it all work out, or at least work out as well as you can.
Right.
And
put your characters in such a hard spot and see if they can get out.
Yeah, and I like the guy. I like old George Dower. Dower is, to some degree, a autopsychological portrait of at least an aspect of myself.
Sure.
I mean, he's one of those guys who, again, just like a certain portion of myself, and I think he resonates with a lot of other people that way. He's trying to do the best he can in confusing circumstances. And he has to react to those circumstances as best he can. And he's not a heroic figure in the sense of willfully being heroic, but really, when the chips are finally down, he does manage to do some brave things. And in that sense, I think that's something that's certainly true for myself, but I think, like I said, it resonates with other people, that we often don't think of ourselves as brave or courageous or heroic, but under the right circumstances, we can be astonishingly so.
And that's because he's more of an intellectual, isn't he?
To some degree, yeah. He lives in his head a little bit. And at the same time, he has very low ambitions. He really just wants to survive. And he keeps getting pulled into situations where he has to do more than that. And to do it in the steampunk sort of environment of crazy inventions and, weird conspiracies and all this stuff running back and forth, he has to, dredge up his inner resources in order to deal with that when really he would just really like to go home and have a cup of tea. And instead, he's got to be a better person and a more heroic person than he ever set out to be. So I do like the guy. And so even though it's been an interval of like nearly, a quarter of a century when I first wrote about him to coming to him now, it's interesting. I never stopped thinking about him during that period of time. He was always one of my favorite characters that I came up with. In that sense, when I decided to jump back into the steampunk pond that had grown into an ocean since I first wrote Infernal Devices, I kind of felt duty-bound by him as if he were a real person. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to see what had become of him in some way. So in some ways, I had to write the second book in order to find out whatever happened to this guy. In that sense, it was nice. It was like meeting an old friend.
A few points on that, yeah. It is nice to see you loyal to that, and it's nice that you moved him forward almost the exact same amount of time since you wrote the last book. And he's a very William Gibson-esque type character in that he's the lost hero. You mentioned complicated plots. I found the book started out very basic plot. Here's black and white. Here's what's got to happen. Yeah. And as you move forward in the story, they're just one more thing. So it got hugely complicated for the character.
Yeah, that's kind of standard thriller construction. Mm-hmm. That somebody, usually the detective or whatever, gets involved in what seems like a pretty simple situation. And then at every step of the way, it gets deeper and deeper and more complicated and more dangerous. I say it's a standard thriller construction, but it's a standard thriller construction because it's such an analog of how we live our own lives. This is something we're constantly encountering in just our day-to-day existence, that things that we at first think are very simple and will be easy to deal with are constantly becoming deeper and deeper. And in that sense, I think it's one of the reasons why thrillers and mysteries and their science fictional and fantastic equivalents, it's one of the reasons why people read them and find them relevant. It's because they look at these and they see a explication of our own lives. Now, naturally, in our own lives, we're very unlikely to encounter walking lighthouses and vast universal conspiracies to blow up London and all this sort of thing. But at the same time, we encounter things all the time with other people that do happen in the same way, that what we initially think is simple turns out to be more complex. So in some sense, we're all of us heroes of thriller novels all the time.
There's like a snowball effect in the novel, as there can be in life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you about one word in the novel. There's a Viscount in there that dresses in furs, and he mentions meat punk. And this felt like this could be somebody that has this particular philosophy about life. And it felt like you were poking fun at how many people like to throw the word punk behind any other word.
Well, that was kind of, in some ways, it's sort of a postmodern, to use a fancy word, postmodern reference to how the whole steampunk word came into existence. That there was this thing going on where everything was becoming something punk. And so I thought, well, let's have some fun with it and actually pull that whole process into a steampunk novel, only now he's talking about some other something punk. Mm-hmm. So you've got essentially this kind of Carnamere. The character is,
right.
Essentially he's an early adapter of the sort of Paleolithic diet lifestyle. And I love the guy, and I'm planning on doing more with him.
He was definitely a fun, crazy one.
He is, and I thought at the same time, wouldn't it be fun if I could come up with one more word that enters the English language? And so I threw meat punk in there, and I've actually had people tweeting and Facebooking references to meat punk already, saying, "Oh, meat punk! Finally, now I know what I really am. I'm a meat punk." And so we'll see. I don't know if it'll take off the same way that the word steampunk did, but it was kind of a fun thing.
I enjoyed how at the end of his little diatribe there, he's like, "Oh, but sometimes I wear full coats and not just furs because it's cold out and I'm a noble."
Sure. Yeah. And
I like I was just going to say, KW, I like your contributions to the English language because they're whimsical, much more fun. Some of the words that are considered part of the English language today are not something I enjoy hearing or saying, such as when people walk around saying conversate. I'd rather hear meat punk than conversate.
There you go. So, yeah.
So some people like to say you're the father of steampunk, or one of the fathers of steampunk. How do you feel about that title?
I think, when it sells more copies of the book,
There you go.
setting with it. But at the same time, it makes me sound like I'm puffing myself up to too large a degree. As there were forerunners to this whole thing. The one I think my friend Tim Powers directed everybody's attention to, and he's completely correct about it. Harry Harrison's A Transatlantic Tunnel Hurrah. That's certainly a definite forerunner of all this sort of thing. And there were quite a few others. So the whole notion of doing crazy, wacky things with the Victorian era, I think for a long time, even much longer than before I started writing, it was naturally attractive to writers like Harrison and others, and they did some fantastic things with it. Partly because we all grew up reading H.G. Wells, and to another large degree, Jules Verne, and so everybody read those, and quite a few people did some things with them, and they were really good books, and they were certainly out there before I ever wrote a word. So in the sense of fathering anything, I'll have to beg off on that. I don't think that happened. If talking like that gets me invited to conventions and I get to sit on panels and have a fun time talking with my friends, like we just did in Brighton, that's great. But really, the first thing I usually say on any of those panels where that kind of thing comes up is, "No, I didn't. Don't blame me."
Well done. And speaking of conventions, when you go to a convention, what do you enjoy doing? What do you look to do when you're not sitting on a panel?
Well, like I said, we just got back from Brighton, England, where we were at World Fantasy Con in Brighton, and had a fabulous time there. Organizers did a great job. We were in a historic old hotel, the Metropole, which I understand was actually the hotel at which Oscar Wilde had one of his famous spats with Lord Douglas. And, Brighton's an interesting town, except it rained the whole time we were there. So we weren't able to get, but I don't think we left the hotel more than once. And anyway, so we were there at World Fantasy Con in Brighton. And I don't go to a lot of conventions. This is like the first one I think I've been to in a couple of years since World Fantasy Con in San Diego. And you're mainly there to see your friends, meet new people. Sometimes there's editors and publishers there, so you get a little business done. And really, it's just sort of, a kind of relaxing and fun thing to be there with a lot of other people who are sort of as insane as you are about some things that the general public aren't insane about. So it's like you hear in the science fiction convention, you're away from the mundanes for a while and you just let your hair down and relax and have a drink with people who are, like I said, as insane as you are.
So if somebody sees you in the bar and wants to buy you a drink, what do they get to buy you?
Oh, what do I like? Well, this is at Brighton, and so we're in the UK, so I'll probably nearly always take a pint of stout.
Good choice.
Yeah, it's one of the, I lived in England back in the 80s, And that was a period of time when the
punk was born.
Well, yeah, this is true, and you'll see some references about that in Fiendish Schemes, actually, sort of buried in there. But it was also a time when the real ale thing was sort of still a underground movement, and you actually had to buy a copy of the Campaign for Real Ale guidebook to find a pub that had real ale. And
Interesting.
yeah, and you'd wind up going to some pretty strange pubs too, and real dens of iniquity. But they had the beer you were looking for. And now you can pretty much go to any pub in England and you'll find pretty decent beer. And so that was kind of a fun thing to kind of get back into that a little bit.
As you travel and go different places. Wow, I've totally lost that question. What the heck?
That's okay.
Places. I don't want to make it sound like I'm just going places looking for something to drink.
No, not at all. It's but that's one of the joys of socializing is mixing it up. Yeah, I totally lost that question. Well, I'm sure it was amazing, and you would have given a great answer.
Yeah, but traveling in general, I mean, I'm hoping to do quite a bit more of it in the future. I mean, I had the very enjoyable and educational experiences of living in England back in the 80s. And now I'm actually down here in Ecuador, and that's a complete trip. And just having a fine time down here.
What are you doing down there?
Wow.
Hanging out, getting a lot of writing done. It's a beautiful country. A lot of exciting things happening in Latin America. In some ways, Latin America has become the new Eastern Europe.
Oh, interesting.
All the bright young things who were going to Prague and Budapest back in the 90s, those people are all coming down to Latin America now. And
I remember.
It's very exciting down here at the moment. And it's always worthwhile for anybody, but especially for writers, to kind of get outside their comfort zone and live in other countries where they have to kind of, wrap their heads around sometimes completely different ways of doing things.
That relates to the question I was going to ask.
Oh,
so,
okay.
As a writer, I carry a steno pad pretty much everywhere I go, and I take notes when they strike.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in interesting places where I pull out my steno pad and start writing down the people in front of me as characters because they are characters.
Yes.
You do this also where you're sitting in a pub or a public place and you're like, oh, I've got to put that one on paper.
I usually don't do it at the moment, but I'll do it when I'm back up in the hotel room or I'm back home. I'll try and get down what I remember of those people. And so I think there was a certain point when I was dating the young woman who eventually became my wife, where she said something along the lines of, okay, so do you writers really have real lives or do you just take notes? And ouch. That kind of hit hard. And it's one of those things that, writers are constantly doing that. And in that sense, any time you can seize an opportunity to expose yourself to more and more different new material, it's something you should sort of seize with both hands. So that's a big reason down here in Ecuador. But besides that, it's an absolutely incredible, beautiful country. So I'll have to see about some kind of steampunk novel that includes a bit of the Latin American stuff.
I think that'd be very cool. It's there's a big steampunk following down in Brazil as well as in Argentina.
Those people actually contacted me. The Brazilian Steampunk Council.
That was probably Bruno Acilio.
I think that might be. Yeah, and so I kind of did an interview for some publication of theirs where they asked, had I thought of coming to Brazil, and I said, hey.
Okay, so that's been a lot of good information and everything. So where can folks find you? Where are you going to be next, and where can they find you online?
Right now, I am back here in Ecuador at KW Junior World Headquarters, and I'm not really doing any traveling anytime soon. I'm basically sitting here in my home office, writing as fast as I can on a bunch of different projects, steampunk included. Online, I have a website and blog at kwjeter.com. No spaces or anything, just kwjeter.com. And I nearly always post information about new books, appearances, and things like that on there, and all the information about following me on Twitter or Facebook is usually there as well. So I would encourage people, if they feel like it, to just check in at kwjeter.com and get the info they need right there. And of course, there's a button there for emailing me directly, which people can take advantage of. And I'm always happy to receive email from people, and very often I even reply to it. So kwjeter.com, that's the best place to find out any kind of news or info about me.
Very good. And everybody keep in mind you can find his newest steampunk novel, Fiendish Schemes, on Amazon.com, as well as, I'm sure, various other places.
Many fine bookstores.
There you go. Thank you so much for joining us, and appreciate the chat.